Therapists of Reddit, have you ever been genuinely scared of a patient and why? I was genuinely scared of a 17-years-old client I had. They were adopted and then given back to Child Protective Services. They told me in session they had an entire plan to burn their house down. Down to the date and the time. I was terrified. I worked with a student who used to threaten us. He'd stand directly behind me with a pencil and threaten to stab me with it. I'd remind him what would happen if he did, but otherwise didn't flinch or try and look at him. He'd get mad then and throw the pencil across the room. It turns out me and one other lady were able to sit stone-faced when he was like that and she never did anything. He'd get way worse if he thought anyone was scared of him. I was the lucky one. He'd threaten to stab her in the eye. I'd always joked that I'd rather not see it coming. Yes. Enough to quit my job. Had high caseload of suicidal teens. Most were medicated and low risk, but had 2 kiddos who had several suicide attempts prior to me, and while under my watch. I was getting physically ill, not sleeping well, constantly worried. I tried to transfer them to a higher level of care but our company was greedy and didn't want to transfer them and lose those funds. I ended up quitting on the spot for these kids to be given a trauma-focused therapist and get the help they needed. Best decision for both myself and those kids. Worked with a patient that complained of reoccurring night terrors about lobsters being boiled alive. He couldn't figure out what was causing them. The fact he killed his GF, chopped her up and boiled her head didn't seem come to him as a reason he might be having these dreams. My only fear is the system will have to release him one day as they could never get him sane enough to stand trial. Not a therapist but a school counselor, small young female. I have a student who is 6'4 with emotional behavioral issues. Reading his social history made me cry because of all the shit he's been through. So, of course, I have a soft spot for him. But his anger gets out of control and it can be very scary. He punched a pole right in front of me once and narrowly missed my face. I looked at him in the eyes and sternly said, "Do you realize you almost just punched me in the face?" He snapped out of his rage and apologized profusely. I wanted to hug him and tell him everything was going to be alright. Edit, I messed up the last sentence and rewrote it. Worked residential for 20 years. Had only 2 kids scare me. One put his baby sister in the freezer. She was found quickly and was okay. He was charming, a good-looking kid and quite clever. Also no history of trauma or abuse. Serious serial killer vibes. One was horribly abused and somehow figured out I was pregnant. I wasn't showing it all since I was fat. He would just stare at my stomach. I asked to be moved to a different group. First kid was or still may be a case study for students at the local big university. Edit. To add why first kid was scary other than the horrible act. Not a therapist but I used to be friends with someone with borderline personality disorder and Munchausen's. She couldn't keep a therapist. It wasn't until late in our friendship that I realized just how mentally ill she was. She lied all of the time. Her efforts even with her therapists were with the sole purpose of being seen as a hero. When therapists would tell her that they weren't able to help her and she needed someone who specialized in BPD, which she didn't think she had, she'd be furious. I genuinely worried about her therapist and anyone around her. There was a time I even let the therapist know what she was saying to see if she wanted me to report it to the police. The woman was very, very scary. I am a woman and a therapist working with people with severe issues. I had a client come in for an initial visit whose file read like that of a serial killer. Animal abuse, torture of other children when he was a child, homicidal attempts. I had an initial moment of intense feelings of awe. And then shifted to what happened to this guy. Turns out that what he went through as a child was more horrible than I could have imagined. We did a lot of great therapy work together and last I heard he was doing really well in his life. As a therapist, I don't give up on people just because they have done and are capable of some pretty horrible stuff. The only one I have felt a little scared of was one who threatened to kill me. I knew she meant it. She had already assaulted a number of other staff. She got sent to a higher security ward and I heard she had broke staff's fingers first day she was there. She held staff and other patients hostage in one of our rooms threatening them but circling the table as if playing with them first. I see violence and aggression regularly and it doesn't faze me but she did. I would purposely avoid eye contact and look straight ahead avoiding her and pretend I wasn't intimidated, as that's what she wanted. I remember a Reddit story about a man whose newborn son kept crying for months, and then became a very difficult child and teen. He did many offenses through the years, to the point when he tried to kill his little sister. After his mom beat the slap out of him he eventually disappeared. People who want the power or authority of being a doctor/nurse EMT/cop, but cannot or will not go through the proper channels can be extremely dangerous. Many serial killers, I know that's extreme, will try to ingratiate themselves with people in these fields to feel important, basically basking in the reflected light of assumed power. Many sociopaths try to become police officers, and looking at current events, and Puck's entire relationship with police, many of them succeed. It's not driven by a desire to help, but the desire for authority. This is part of the reason I'm hesitant to do psychiatry here, even though I love it as a subject. Where I live is a tiny and crowded city. One of the most crowded in the world. Everyone knows each other. And it won't be hard at all to find out where you live. A colleague of mine was once followed while he was riding his bike home after duty. The guy following was a dependence syndrome patient. And was asking him to write him Rx for Valium, in the middle of the road, turning it into a sort of bike chase. Luckily it was all verbal and the doc managed to de-escalate. Distracting my mind always made my compulsions worse. I described it as when you really have to pee, and you distract yourself, and a bit starts to leak out because you aren't focusing all your energy on holding it in. Granted, my OCD diagnosis was reconned after I started acting on the impulses pretty regularly. Now they are looking at possible Tourette's as a cause. My uncle is one, and the answer is yes. Therapists aren't like they show in movies where they only deal with insanely complex and tough issues. Most of the people that come see him just have normal problems that most people can relate to. People seek therapy for a whole assortment of issues. So if someone goes to him with violent thoughts, or deeply disturbing issues and ideologies, it shocks him like it would shock the rest of us. They are just trained to handle it better than the rest of us, but deep down their reaction to it is the same. When I was in med school, our psychiatry attending told that years ago she dyed her hair red. Few weeks later she had a patient who obsessed with redhead women. Patient was thinking about killing redhead women and then putting their plucked head into boxes. So she had 2 weeks off and patient was carried by another doc. This was early on in training, but a mandated client had dropped acid before the session and it started coming on while we were talking. He didn't want to be there as it was and was much larger than me, 5 feet 0 inches. Once he got to threatening me for being the reason everything was wrong with the world, I ended up needing to get up and leave my own office to get a supervisor. I definitely thought he would hit and or strangle me if I stayed. Person on the other side. Went to my university's psych hospital due to suicidal ideation. Was 18 at the time. I was lobbed in with the under 22 group and there's this fireman in his 20s who I'd learned through the grapevine, other nosy ass patients, was bipolar. No biggie, we all got something wrong in there, right? He was very quiet, decently attractive and kept to himself even in group sessions. He would always give me this penetrative, unblinking stare all day long. I'm very shy and hadn't spoken 2 words to the guy. Maybe smiled in passing if I made eye contact, which I avoided due to the staring. In the main room, like a living room I guess for a psych ward, we'd all be hanging out and he'd sit across from me with a sketchbook. Honestly just thought he was passing time. Once you're committed you can't leave unless the doctor says so. Anyways, my mom comes to the hospital to visit me and she noticed the guy staring at me. She walks behind him while he's with his sketchbook and her entire body froze. Like completely locked up as if you're watching a video and press pause. He had drawn a very detailed picture of me, hanging from the ceiling in the psych ward. She calmly tells the nurse and the guy is removed from the room. Never saw him again. A couple of days later I overheard some nurses saying that the guy had filled the entire sketchbook with different drawings of me, dead, in different scenarios. Honestly, it was scariest thing I've ever been through. Have one patient that calls us saying he overdosed on meds probably once every 1 to 2 months, wears stuff with our logo and pretends to be on our ambulance service. This person used to show up to actual scenes and pretend to be one of our first responders. It took a deputy putting him in cuffs before he stopped. He also has a radio and a pager. Radio only receives, and will record out conversations and send them to me. Strangely enough, he is actually a very nice person, and if you talk to him without mentioning the ambulance you would never know he has issues. Doesn't scare me but scares some of our more experienced crew members, so I'm guessing they know something I don't. I worked with a student who used to threaten us. He'd stand directly behind me with a pencil and threaten to stab me with it. I'd remind him what would happen if he did, but otherwise didn't flinch or try and look at him. He's get mad then and throw the pencil across the room. It turns out me and one other lady were able to sit stone-faced when he was like that and she never did anything. He'd get way worse if he thought anyone was scared of him. I was the lucky one. He'd threatened to stab her in the eye. I'd always joked that I'd rather not see it coming. My parents foster children and had one girl like this, though could hide it. She acted sweet as molasses but turned into Satan. Pulled a plastic bag over my head while I was driving on an interstate. Told my dad she would dance on his grave one day. Dad caught her one night with a steak knife in her bed. The disturbing part was that she was inching the point closer and closer to her own eyeball. When asked what the hell she was doing, she replied she was curious what stabbing her eyeball would feel like. Kid creeped me the hell out. She was in therapy of course, but I really doubt she is normal now. Just hope she hasn't hurt herself or someone else. Thank you listening, you lovely people. Subscribe to Hereditary for more creepy stories.